Thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Write Project podcast and radio program. This is a show about writing and modern Newfoundland author culture. This program is produced and recorded at CHMR FM 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and is aired on other great stations in the province and elsewhere in the country. It can also be heard online at www.chmr.ca. I'm your host, Matthew Ledrew, author of such novels as Touch Your Nose and Jacoby Street, and founder of Engine Books. Let's see what we have today. Welcome once again to a very special episode of the Write Project podcast. Today we are on the phone with Gareth Mitton. He is an author, originally from Northern England. He lived in Newfoundland for many a year and is currently living in
Moncton, New Brunswick.
New Brunswick. We're not talking to him about his travel habits, though. We're here because he has a hard science fiction novel called Pedestal, coming out this May from Engine Books. Did I get all that right, Gareth?
Yeah, I think you put the emphasis on the wrong syllable, though. But,
yeah, I think it's actually called Pedestal. I think it's... Yeah.
That was a creative choice. I appreciated that.
Yes. Beyond that, so Pedestal's this really cool novel. Note to anyone listening who doesn't already know, I published this book, so I'm slightly biased, but it's actually a really good book. We'd been looking for science fiction for quite some time, and it's the kind of really true science fiction that I always loved and wanted, kind of Clarkian science fiction, where it's about one idea, and every section of the novel explores that fully. Like, it's explored from a philosophical standpoint, and then it's explored from a legal standpoint. The legal battles in it are kind of my favorite part of the novel, and explored from a humanist standpoint and from a technological standpoint. So it's kind of about fully exploring not even a world, but one core concept in this very heady intellectual way, which I really enjoy. And if you're into that kind of thing, then Pedestals definitely should be on your reading list this May. But we've got the author on there now, and I wanted to ask him about it. Gareth, just tell me in your words about Pedestal. What inspired you to write it, and what's it about?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's it's very kind of you to talk about it that way, and it's interesting when you hear somebody else sort of describe something you've written. It is a bit deep, I suppose, isn't it, and a bit like, philosophical in many respects, but
deep compared to what I write. I write crime stuff, so it's like, there is a bad guy. Let's stop the bad guy.
Right. But I think the kind of plot of Pedestal. It is heavily concept based, but there is kind of a story to it. There's kind of a murder, and we're not really sure why, and then there's kind of a bit of a race towards a goal, but definitely there's so many pieces of inspiration that went into it, and what's perhaps most kind of interesting about it is that it was written from kind of conception to final draft over a period of about 20 years. So it was something that I started in university back in England around 1999, around the turn of the millennium. So a lot of as a kid, I've been really into science fiction. I loved everything from reading like the old school, like a big Philip K. Dick fan. I discovered Blade Runner late on one night on TV when I was a kid, and just was absolutely mesmerized by that kind of near future technological, this could kind of happen type science fiction. And that kind of led me to Philip K. Dick, because of course the source material for Blade Runner was Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was a novel by Dick, and he wrote tons of short stories, so I got interested in that. So that, he was writing way back, it was like the 50s, and So there's very old school kind of sci-fi was in my soul, but I also loved, Red Dwarf. Like, was a huge influence on me as a kid. And actually, there are some ideas that come from. And for anyone who's not familiar with Red Dwarf is a satirical, like, parody science fiction show, British, that ran in the 80s and into the 90s mainly. I think they still made episodes as recently as a year or so ago.
Do British people like satire?
Oh. It went like, but it's funny that there was some really. The thing about Red Dwarf, not to get on a massive tangent, but I probably will.
Yeah.
The Red Dwarf was funny, yeah, and yes, they were taking the Mickey out of Star Trek and Star Wars and lots of other those kinds of shows, but they had some brilliant concepts too, like some really cool ideas. Like there was one where, and it was the earliest example I could remember, where they kind of jacked into these all immersive video games, and it was like they were kind of in a different world, and as silly as they did it, like the ideas of it really kind of sparked my young brain. So there was loads of that, and then around that time you had The Matrix, which was a big influence on me, and actually not sci-fi, but Fight Club. That movie was a big influence on the kind of the parallel kind of nature of the characters. You can kind of see a bit of that in there, I think.
Yeah, Fight Club was huge on me. I think I did pick up on a little bit of that, but Fight Club was pretty big influence on me in my later writing career. I think I'd already had a few books out by then, but just the driving home of like that theme of duality that ended up coming in to my work a lot. I think partly because of that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Like there were a couple of things about Fight Club. The duality is definitely the word. I love that concept, and just also that, like, I watched it as a 19-year-old in university, starting writing this novel. I remember going to the cinema, like, me and my friends saw the ad for it, and we were like, what is that? That was different. Went to see it, and I remember coming out. Fight Club had more of an effect on me than any movie I'd seen. And it sparked me off for years of this kind of anti-materialistic attitude that kind of lives with me to this day. I don't keep a lot of things, material possessions. The things you own end up owning you, all that stuff. Really impacted me at that time. And in many ways, like, affected me a lot in my life. Anyway, we are getting a bit tangential, but I think, the story of Pedestal, like I say, 20 years in the making, if you want to be dramatic about it. But essentially, it was something that I started in university. I think, like you do when you're young, there's a lot of distractions. I came and went from it. I think I probably finished the first draft around age 23, so around 2003. I was born in 1980, so it's always really easy for me to know how old I was in a certain year. I had like a finished first draft probably, 16, 17 years ago. And then, I did that thing that writers sometimes do. I sat on it for a lot of time. I embarked on a career in marketing and advertising, and got real busy and got real interested in other stuff, and I wrote other stuff along the way. Now and again I would dust it off and play around with it, but it got to a point where it was a little bit of an albatross around my neck, actually, and I felt it was really preventing me from writing. Maybe it was a good excuse not to write other things, because I never finished that novel, I can't possibly move on to another big project. So I'd write short stories and stuff, but it became very evident to me that I needed to finish it. A friend of mine, a real good friend, a university friend actually, who was around when I started it, some years later offered to take it, read it. He's just such a good writer, Pete Farmer, lives in Australia now actually. And he took it and he gave me very in-depth notes, and that became, then it sat again for about another year because I was like, oh my god, that looks like a big undertaking, but he's right. He's right with all this stuff. I need to do a real in-depth edit, and eventually it took some time, but I started carving off, an hour a day for over a period of months, and I hacked away at that thing and created a pretty polished final draft, which is where our paths crossed, Matt, a couple of years ago.
Yes.
I have this thing, and I think it's pretty much done now. Are you interested in reading it?
Yes, and it was a remarkable time before Engine blew up the way it has, because I had time to read something you'd given me in a fairly short order, which would not happen anymore.
Right. So that was lucky for me, for sure. I think, and I got to a point with it where it was like, this is something that I need to get out there and, out in the world and out of myself, because I have tons of other ideas for stories that I'd like to move on to. But it's also something that I think all writers have mixed feelings about their work, but I have definitely a lot of love for it. It's been in my life for most of my adult life, and it's going to be interesting now and cool to share it, and more people are actually starting to read it, because this was a story that was, exclusively in my own mind for most of its life so far. So just having other people read it is great, and then having people read it and go, this is actually pretty good, is awesome. And now a lot more, hopefully, people are going to read it, thanks to you and an Engine, and that's very exciting too.
That is the hope.
That is the hope. So yes, please buy my book. That's the sales pitch. So that's a lot about kind of, I guess, the story behind the story. But did you want me to talk about the story itself, maybe?
Yes, no, absolutely. Please talk about the story itself. So we talked about like the core concept, and well, in loose terms, we talked about that the different people, the way the different institutions react to it. Can you talk about the core concept, like the idea, the technology that all this is kind of based around?
Yeah. So basically, when you're asked to describe what your story's about, it's always one of the worst questions a writer can get, right? And what you do is you sit down and, after being asked that question a number of times and failing miserably to satisfactorily respond, and you go, what is this story about? And in advertising, because obviously I've spent a lot of my time working in that world, my old boss and mentor used to say to me, you've got to be, it's not a concept unless you can explain it to me in one sentence, right? If you can't tell me in one sentence, it's not a good idea, because it's too complicated.
That's true.
Or you don't really understand what it is yet. So I got my one word description of Pedestal is, man reinvents God through technology.
Okay.
So in terms of, that's how I see it. Like, that's really, to me, what it's really about is, because I'm a person that's I love tech and I love gadgets, I really do, but I'm also terrified of them.
Right.
Where technology's going. So I really wanted to explore that. Like, if we should, because as well, it's just the pace of which technology is advancing, obviously. It's just orders of magnitude every year. It's not like, it advanced this much in the last year, so it will advance that much next year. It's going to advance a whole lot more, like tenfold in a year. It's really kind of, it's cool, but it's also kind of scary. So, remember now, this was 20 years ago, so I had to make some adjustments. This is kind of interesting, because at first I had people using these really high-tech gadgets that I call notepads, and they were like little slabs that you could just touch and move things around on. And of course, in the intervening years, the iPad happened, and now my technology of the future was an everyday technology. So I had to go back and reimagine what that was.
That is, there's an author, a sci-fi author that I used to read a lot of, name of Warren Ellis. He also writes comic books. And in an interview once, he said he was writing Iron Man at the time. This is right before the movies came out, so it was like primed to be. It's what the design the suit was based on his run, everything. But he was asked what the hardest part of writing this futurist Iron Man take was, and he said the technology, because I'm about 2 years ahead of the publishing schedule. Like, I've got 2 years worth of issues written ahead of time, and I keep
Right.
having to go back and change things because I'm writing futuristic technologies, and the technology catches up.
Yeah. So that is a real thing, and it caused me some problems. I think the core, like the main, the sort of two main technologies though in Pedestal. One is Scape, SCAPE, which is actually it does stand for something, if I can remember what it was. I think it's the Social Correction and Protection Engine or something like that. That's not exactly it. I should know, but Scape is essentially the evolution of the internet. And the other thing that was really interesting is that, and sorry, that's one technology, and the other one is alts, or alternative immersive environments, which is essentially the evolution of video games. So you've got like the evolution of the internet and the evolution of video games, and how that kind of ties together into the story. But what was also really interesting with that was that I kind of had like these terminals that you accessed Skate through, and the other thing was that because it took me so darn long to get around to actually finishing this thing, other movies and books and stuff came out, and I'd kind of see a preview or a trailer or read a review, and I'd be like, oh no.
Yeah.
This is kind of my idea. So there were a bunch of those. Like there's stuff in Ex Machina, which is Alex Garland, one of my favorites. And the brains of these androids that he's creating kind of pull directly from the internet, essentially, right? They pull all their information from the internet, which has become this huge stockpile of information and data, like about the human race, essentially, and how people are, and it has people actively engaged in it. So it becomes this resource. But I was thinking about this like when the internet was still relatively young, right? And I was kind of looking at it and saying, that's really interesting. And there's been movies that have come out in the intervening years too, where like there's been kind of emergence of man and the internet, or the internet has gotten a bit out of line and kind of taken over somehow. But my mind back in the day when I started writing Pedestal was the internet essentially doesn't think, right? It's kind of like this. It feels like a living thing, but it's only a living thing in as much as the living things that interact with it. It's essentially a great big massive storage space, right?
Yeah.
So in my mind, I was like, if God, like what I was going to with it, and it sounds a bit deep when I start talking about God and such, but I feel like, we've definitely, there are parallels there with religion and things like that. Like, I don't get too deep into the book, but the idea that we kind of worship the technology is very, very apparent to me. But if you want like a godlike character, I felt like that had to come from outside of the internet looking in. It had to be something that was kind of seen through the eyes of people and could interact and draw information. So that became kind of the other big part of this, that there's this kind of super intelligent AI that we've never seen before, its ability to learn and evolve. And if that gets access to the internet, it gets access to pretty much everything. And then if we've given it the ability to make judgment based on that, what does that look like, and how do we come out of the other side of that?
Yeah, really.
Kind of a scary question, right? So, and the technology that is used in the book is kind of nano technology. So that's kind of the way I kind of look at tech. You've kind of gone from, palm, desktop to palm to wearable now, with things like watches and headbands, visors and stuff, glasses, Google Glass, all that stuff. Where do you go next? And to me, the only place you can go is within, right? Like, it's now the technology has to sort of get inside of us. So nanotechnology, this idea of tiny microscopic robots that go into latch onto certain parts of your brain and start interacting and altering your perceptions of reality, seem like a pretty feasible. I mean, it's a pretty dark. I don't know if it would ever really come about, but it certainly seemed like that's where, in my mind, the technology had logically to go next. So that all kind of lined up to make sense for me to be able to tell the story, and it creates these nice parallel worlds. The future that I imagined has already is divided, and again, these themes of duality, Matt, like, come through a lot in the society of the future that is in the book as well. We live in an age where essentially there's a very small percentage that have a massive percentage of the wealth. The middle class is disappearing, and the rest of us are kind of fighting out miles and miles below these very rich people.
Yeah.
In the book, that's actually realized physically, and I got to do a name drop for, if I can say their name right.
Sure.
Atinom Irisin. Have I said that the right way around? No, it's Irisin Atinom.
Okay.
Who designed the book cover and captured it absolutely beautifully.
Oh, yeah. Yes. How'd you come across them, by the way?
Oh man, that was so. We all sort of like agonize over what are we going to do about a book cover. There's so many options, man. Like when you get into design styles, I mean, it's just really endless. But I always kind of had a vague picture in my head. I always felt like depicting the world was going to be important, and what it is this idea of the original cities have become sort of like the slums essentially, and the rich people live in these mega cities that are built high above on these giant plates, and that concept was highly influenced by Final Fantasy VII. And I only realized that recently because they're doing a remake of that video game.
Okay.
And I was watching the preview and I was like, holy crap. And it was like almost like a subliminal thing where they had these cities, or they had, like, I think it was cities like on a raised platform. And that really must have influenced me, because that dropped around 97, I think. So it would have been all feeding into the young brain that was kind of creating this world. So yeah, so you've got like the underside, as I call it, the slums, and then the top side above, with these towering, beautiful, clean glass and steel buildings, versus below where it's all getting a little bit kind of nasty. So I went looking on the internets, and on Instagram, and I stumbled across, I've got to be saying their name right, Irisin Atinom, I think is how you pronounce it.
Okay.
They were just posting like these just amazing future cityscape type things, like very kind of Blade Runner-esque future cities, neon kind of And then there was like stuff where it's kind of like some of the buildings are kind of degraded, or I think they call it brutal cities, if I'm using the terminology correctly. But I started following them, and I was like, okay, so I want it to look like that, so I'm going to go and try to find that. But I couldn't find that anywhere else. So in the end, I was like, okay, where are these guys? Okay, they're in Athens, Greece. I'm going to send them an email, and I'm going to say, hey, I'm a first-time author. I just love your work. I really want to use, and originally I was just going to say, can I use one of your images for the cover? Or maybe like take, one of the beautiful futuristic CG skyscrapers that they created.
Okay.
But they were super keen on the idea right from the start, and the conversation went immediately to, we want to design the cover of your novel. Simply because, it turns out they're actually like architects, so a lot of their work is CGI, real world, like, this is what your leisure center is going to look like, or whatever it might be. Like they create actual like CGI architecture. But their interest is sci-fi, and they love the same kinds of stuff that I love. And they're actually, it turns out the guy is the similar age to me, and we really kind of hit it off. And he said it would just be really cool to design the cover of a science fiction novel. That really excites us, just as an art project,
Yeah.
And I think he thought it was kind of cool that we were in Canada, like we think, oh, Greece, that's so exotic, but to them, Canada, that's pretty cool too, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it really it went from there, and you're kind of like nervous because you don't really know these people, and you hope that they're good people, and they seem like good people, and we had some conversations, but I quickly understood, you can kind of sense when somebody is legitimately an artist, right? And the questions they were asking, they really wanted to understand the world. They so he kind of asked me a few questions. I wouldn't hear from him for a couple of days, then he'd come back and clarify, what are the support structures? Do you describe the support structures that support these massive plates that these cities sit on? Do you describe those in the book? What do they look like? So it was really interesting to sort of say, oh yeah, I kind of have a scene where there's this massive elevator going up one of them. So they're not just like sticks to hold up the city. They're actually, and if you look at the cover, the way he designed it, they've got like intricate little like lights and rooms and things going on in these structures that hold up the plate. It's an incredible design. I really want everyone to have a look at it. It kind of at first glance looks like a big city with like a reflection of a city below it. And that's what's so cool is it's not until you look really closely at it that reflection, quote unquote, below is not a reflection at all. It's the underside city. And it's a massive sprawling city with all these little houses down at the bottom.
Oh, that's interesting.
All on its own, right?
That's really interesting.
It's like I always said, working in marketing, my role was always like writer and like creative director. So like, the ideas person essentially.
Yeah.
And I would like a good designer or an art director will take your idea and they'll just make it better. And this is a perfect example of that. I could never have imagined this scene the way that they were able to create it. So I was really, really touched by it, actually.
That's excellent. All right, well, everyone, you should absolutely check out Pedestal. It went on sale in May. Yeah, thank you very much for coming on and talking about this, Gareth. I think everyone should check out this book.
Thanks very much, Matt. Thanks a lot to Engine for publishing Pedestal. It means a lot, and I really hope that people will pick up a copy, and love to hear your feedback. So, find me, Gareth Mitton, on social media. Let me know what you thought about it.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, well, thanks for coming on again. For all of you, we'll be here again next week at 4:30 Newfoundland time or online at chmr.ca. Please tune in and we'll talk more about writing culture in Newfoundland.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Write Project podcast. If you've made it this far, please consider watching another video or clicking subscribe down in the bottom there. Even consider hitting the bell so that you can be notified when we upload new videos. We're going to start doing that more frequently, even weekly now. Time was we would let them stay on SoundCloud for some time and upload infrequently. No longer. And if you're a really big fan and you want to be really awesome and keep hearing content like this with content by other writers, please check out our Patreon and see how you can support us. There are different tiers and different reward levels. If you yourself happen to be a writer with a book coming out and you would like to be featured on the Write Project podcast, please reach out. We would love to hear from you and get your opinion on writing matters. Thank you again for listening. I'm Matthew LeDrew from the Write Project podcast.